Welcome, everyone, to the VBC Bible Institute, and welcome back. It's a brand new year. We have a lot to do. The world has been crazy. It has caused lots of distractions. It's caused me to have to spend a lot of time talking about a lot of different things. It's messed up. It's messed up so much. But we are going to return back to our course, A Journey Through the Bible. I know some of you have been hard at work. I've seen some of the things that people have sent me, 7 pages, 8 pages, 10 pages, very extensive. You did the work. I hope you benefited greatly from it. It's for your benefit. I hope you learned something. And I do apologize for the delay, just trying to figure out, like, what do I want to do? How do I want to accomplish this? I knew that I was taking on probably more than I could handle by trying this, but I wasn't quite prepared that the world was going to fall apart. Okay. I wasn't quite prepared that the world was going to fall apart. I would have a hard time right now. Like if I was a teacher in a seminary, like I would have a hard time saying, hey, today, my subject that I'm supposed to teach is this. I would have a hard time using the class time to talk about the subject and not deal with everything happening in our world. There's just so much going on. And especially for Christians, right now we need a biblical perspective more than at any time. And at least in any time in modern church history, because the church is just going through so much upheaval and Christianity is being redefined. So I have to address those issues, and it takes up lots of time. And then the next thing you know, you're like 1 week goes to 2 weeks, and you're like, man, I haven't done another lesson for the Bible Institute. Okay, what do I want to accomplish? What do I want to accomplish? What do I want to do? So we're just going to jump back into Genesis chapter 12. We're going to just work through this. I want to take a massive detour. Let me make this very clear. I want to take a massive detour, and I have a book suggested currently in the Theology Central Book Club. If you should join the Theology Central Book Club, you really should. If you go to theologycentral.net, that's theologycentral.net, that's our pod page, theologycentral.net, go to the blog section. You'll have to go 2 or 3 down, and you'll see an entry. You'll see a blog post for Theology Central Book Club, introducing the Theology Central Book Club, something along those lines. Look at the article, click the link, and in the book club, in fact, I'll just pull it up right now so that I can give you the exact name. We may have to do some work for this book for the Bible Institute. We really need to. I may try to make it a course for the Bible Institute. I don't know where we're going to cover it, but we need to definitely do so. Let me, here we go. Let me pull up Amazon. It's going to pull up book clubs. Here we go. Theology Central. All right. You people need to be joining right now as I'm speaking. Okay. All right. Here we go. Where is it? All right. Here is the name of the book. The name of the book is A Survey of Dispensational and Covenantal Theologies. A Survey of Dispensational and Covenantal Theologies. All right. It's discontinuity and to continuity. Discontinuity to continuity. A survey of dispensational and covenantal theologies. Again, discontinuity to continuity. A survey of dispensational and covenantal theologies. This is a book that we're going to definitely work through because it comes down. Look, there's so many theological issues that arises from Genesis 12 and following. All right, when we get to this Abrahamic covenant and the covenant that God is making with Abraham, we know that he's going to make this covenant, and one of the sign of that covenant is going to be circumcision. Well, it leads to so many theological issues, right? Okay, so these promises that God made for Abraham, were they for Israel? Do they get taken from Israel and then ultimately given to the church? Do we understand them literally, figuratively, or were they literally fulfilled, but then Israel failed and now they become spiritual promises to the church? And was circumcision replaced by baptism? And if it was replaced by baptism, does that mean we baptize babies who are 8 days old and then say, now you're a part of the covenant family, but it doesn't save you or it saves you? What do we do? All of these issues come down to, and you can kind of break it down between covenantal theology and dispensational theology. Those are the two major streams trying to answer. And the question they're trying to answer is, what do we do? And how do we understand these Old Testament situations and how they then move, and how we as New Testament Christians, how does this connect? What's the continuity between the two? Is there discontinuity? Is there continuity? How do we make them fit together? What do we do? And then you'll ultimately end up with some answers. And a lot of this then plays into hermeneutics, and there's so many issues. So I definitely challenge you to read that book. Again, just join the Theology Central Book Club. Go to suggested books. Look at the suggested books. You'll see it there. Discontinuity to continuity, dispensational theology, and covenantal theology. You'll see it. Definitely put that on your Kindle, get a physical copy, and start reading it, at least, just slowly. Just start reading slowly and start struggling with some of these questions, because you've already, whether you like it or not, you've already found yourself going along with one of these streams, because you're either in a covenantal theology church or probably a dispensational theological church. You're in one of those two. And so either you've thought this through, or you've just kind of gone along with the default position that was handed to you. And it's something to think about. And it all flows from right here in Genesis chapter 12. So I want to take a big detour and go after that. But what we're going to just start trying to do is work our way through Genesis. We're just going to start trying to just work our way through. And hopefully, this will be helpful and beneficial. So are you ready? Let's just jump right back in to Genesis chapter 12, all right? We've got a chapter with 20 verses. We've got a chapter with 20 verses. Now, we're going to work together to try to see what kind of structure jumps out at us. I'm trying to do this somewhat in a lecture format, but if you know my Bible study exercise, I'm going to try to pull you into this, all right? So here we go. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. So we have a command here, all right? And we could argue that he'd already been commanded, and we could get in a whole discussion about that. But hey, this is what I want you to do. We have a command here. Get up, leave everything, and you go into a land that I will show you. I will, future. I will show you ultimately the land. Right now, get up and leave and come here. Follow me, all right? And remember, we talked about that from a devotional perspective. So we have a command. Then he starts with the promises. I will make of thee, from thee, Abram, I will make from thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Those are massive promises given to Abraham. And you can see that some of these promises clearly seem to go from those who will come from Abraham. You would think the nation, the Hebrews, Israel, right? You think it has to have some clear connection to them. But ultimately, through him, all the families of the earth is going to be blessed. These are some, massive promises. Verse 4. So we have the command. We have promises, right? Then we have verse 4, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. Now, what do we do with this? There'll be people, it sounds like not incomplete obedience. It sounds like some would say partial obedience, but partial obedience really is complete disobedience, really, because he said, leave everything. And the next thing you know, here comes Lot, and here comes all these other things that they're bringing with them. Do we view that? Now, this is just very important about the biblical narrative. Sometimes the biblical narrative simply describes what happens. It doesn't assign judgment. It doesn't assign good, bad. It just says, here's what happened. It doesn't, sometimes the text, the narrative doesn't say, hey, everyone, this is where you get very upset. Hey, this is how the emotions you should feel. This is how you should view it. It just describes what happened. I will say in the narrative that's presented to us, he's told specifically, listen, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house. Next thing you know, we read, Lot went with him. Verse 5, Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son. Abram took with him. He took them. So you could say, well, just Lot just kind of followed along. But here in verse 5 seems to make it very clear. Abraham is like, no, you're coming with me. So he and all their substance he gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and they came into the land of Canaan. They bring all of this stuff. Now, we can over-spiritualize this. I will say this. I think this is at least fair. We talk about Abraham. We'll just say this before we I don't want to jump too far ahead. We'll say this. I think this is fair. Abraham receives basically a call from God to forsake everything and follow him, right? We talked about the same idea in the New Testament when Christ calls us to forsake, take up our cross, die to ourselves, and follow him. It's the same kind of call, right? This is the call that God calls. When God calls you to come to him, he says, deny yourself, take up a cross, die, forsake everything, and follow him. That's the call of being a follower of Christ, is we turn from what we want and we follow him. But we all know, look, everyone knows, no one does it perfectly. No one does it perfectly 20 years following Christ. We don't do it perfectly 50 years. We're never going to do it perfectly on this side of heaven. Until we're glorified, we're not going to do it perfectly. And so the text just says, here's what God told him to do, and here's what he did. Here's the command. Here's the promises. And then here is the action. The action. And the action doesn't appear to be complete. And I don't think that means we have to harp on him and we have to, start kicking Abram and Sarai and say, look at you losers. I think we just have to see this is the way the life of faith works. It's never perfect. It's never pretty. We sometimes have this vision that, okay, the minute you get saved, boom, everything is now you don't sin. No, all of us is incomplete obedience, which is basically total disobedience over and over and over and over and over and over again. Right? So a lot of people make a big deal out of that. Verse 6, Abram passed through the land unto the places of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. So Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. All right, so they get there. The Canaanite was then in the land. That's an interesting phrase. Right? Okay, we could do a lot of things there, but we won't. Okay, verse 7, Genesis 12:7. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land, and there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. All right, now, I think we can make this work if we want to kind of break this down. We have a command. Hey, get up, get out, leave everything, follow, come follow me to the land I'm going to show you. Next, we have a promise. Hey, I want you to know that I'm going to make of thee a great nation. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. You're going to be a blessing. I'm going to bless them that bless you. I'm going to curse them that curse you. And through you and in you, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. All right? Then Abraham says, okay, got the command. He takes up and he doesn't follow completely. We'll call it, we should just call it disobedience. I don't know what else. I know I've had Christians argue, no. It's not disobedience because you're supposed to take care of your family. Well, the text clearly says leave everything, and he doesn't leave everything. I don't know how you can say it's not disobedience. It's incomplete. It's not, he doesn't follow what God calls him to follow. But then I think something interesting happens here in verse 7. And it's kind of interesting. And the Canaanite was then in the land. Is that kind of giving us a hint that, hey, okay, you're going to take me here. The Canaanites are in the land. Is that saying that there's possible danger, possible threat? I don't know if we read it that way, but it's interesting. So we have the command, we have the promise, we have the disobedience. Okay, then we have an encouragement. Do we have encouragement here? Does God, because the text says the Canaanite was in the land, and is there like a concern there? And then God steps in and appeared unto Abraham and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. And almost like I'm promising you, I'm going to give you this land. Well, has he already made that promise? No, he hasn't made that promise. I guess we almost have to call this a new promise. All right, so I guess what we could do, we could break it down this way, because it is a promise, but I see it almost as an encouragement. But there's a promise there. It's just interesting the way it comes across. I'll try to give you the way my mind is thinking. Hey, Abraham's moving. They're following. They're coming into the land, and then the text says the Canaanites were there. And the very next thing, God steps in and says, "Hey, I want you to know this land, right?" And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, "Unto this land will I give, unto thy seed will I give this land." It has to be considered at least a part of the promises. All right. It has to be a considered part of the promises, but at the same time, there's an encouragement. So this is what I would do. This is how I would, if you're working on taking notes, here's what I would do. We have the command. We have that in 12:1. We have the promise. We'll put promises. We'll have promises. Verse 2, verse 3, and verse 7. Verse 2, verse 3, and verse 7, and you should list out what the promises are. You should list out those promises. And please note, you cannot deny, I will give this land unto your seed. Unto your seed. If that's real land, and if that seed is referring to Israel, and if you say that seed is spiritual Israel, then spiritual Israel should be given literal land, unless you say the land is not literal and the seed there is not physical, it's spiritual. Well, that makes no sense, because Abraham understands that it's got to be physical seed, because he understands that it's going to be like, he's going to be asking, where is the son that you promised me? If I'm going to be a father of a nation, I've got to have children. So I just, we can get into a whole discussion right there. So let's do that. So we have the command, 12:1. We have the promise, chapter 12, verse 2, verse 3, and verse 7, right? Write down what those promises are. Write down what those promises are. List those promises out. You got to do that, because whenever you have these debates with people, especially in the covenantal theological side, you got to get into, well, what was actually promised, okay? And if they'll say, well, that was fulfilled in the church. Well, how was it fulfilled in the church? What are you talking about, right? Next, you have the disobedience. We just have to label it disobedience. Verse 4, right? Then I'm going to call verse 7, I'm going to say we have encouragement in verse 7. I know verse 7 also contains a promise, but I think it contains encouragement, because in the midst of this disobedience, verse 4 and 5 and 6, as they are moving along, bringing all of these people bringing Lot and all of these things with him, we were told that the Canaanite was in the land. The Canaanite was in the land. And I was like, hey, I'm going to promise you these things, but it's not always going to appear. It's not going to work out maybe the way you want it to work. And then verse 7, and the Lord appeared unto Abram. And so he appears unto him, and I'm going to call this encouragement. It's like the Canaanites are in the land, and Abraham may have gotten concerned, and God appears to him. And yes, we put the promise with the promise, but he appears unto him, and he tells him, unto thy seed will I give this land. And there buildeth he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. And he builds an altar and he worships. He worships. So I want you to think about this. Abraham has been given commands. He's been given promises. And he's been given I will say encouragement. The Lord appeared unto him. And look, next what happens? We have worship. Very important. We have the commands. We have the promises. Yes, we do have disobedience here. We have encouragement. God appears unto him. And then we have worship. We have worship. Now, why do I think this is important? As Christians, as we're trying to walk this Christian life, we have the commands of God. We have the promises of God, right? We have the commandments. We have the promises. And guess what we also have in the midst of all that? We have our disobedience. But you know what we also have? We also have the encouragement of God's word. And it should always lead us to worship. In the midst of trying to navigate God's commands, understanding his promises, and trying to navigate our own disobedience, we have to be people who build an altar and who worships the Lord. We have to be that. We have to be worshipers. Right? So we have the worship. Right now, verse 8. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. More worship. And Abram journeyed, going on still towards the south. Now stop right here. Okay, now let's go through this again. I know I'm going through this in a tedious way, but I think there's something being developed here that we can often overlook. And so I'm trying to make a painstaking process to try to get there. All right. So here we go. We have a command or commands. I think we should call them the commandments, because there's multiple commandments. Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land. So go, 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 go. All right. Here's the things I need you to do. Then promises. We have the promises, verse 2, 3. And again, I think 7 contains a promise. 7 contains a promise. There's no way to get around that. We have that. Okay. Next, we have the disobedience. There's just no way to get around it. Bringing Lot. Now, God doesn't condemn him. God doesn't step in and chastise him. And a lot of times when Christians read the Old Testament, they don't understand that. They're like, wait, they did this and God didn't do anything. And you've done things and God doesn't immediately strike you down. Lightning doesn't immediately come crashing down. The walls come caving down. And a voice from heaven saying, you did wrong. It doesn't work that way. That's not the life of faith the way it works. All right? So he doesn't quite follow what he's supposed to follow. He's moving. That's good. But with that, I think it just shows that no matter, even when we're trying to obey God, disobedience is present. All right. Now, the Lord, and then we have the encouragement. God appears unto him, and then we have the worship. I just want to stress this, that in our Christian life, we've got commands, we've got promises, we've got sin, but we have to be worshipers. We have to constantly worship God. We have to constantly turn to God. We have to constantly do that. Our failure, our mess-ups, cannot discourage worship. It should encourage worship. It should drive us to God, not from him. All right. Let me see, where else do we want to go here? Then we come to verse 10. Verse 10, we read this. And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. All right. Now, what else do we have in the text? Well, we've got the commandments, we've got the promises, we've got the disobedience, we've got the encouragement, we've got the worship, and now what do we have? We have the trials of life. We have the trials of life. And what's important about this? What's very important to understand about this? Even though you're a worshiper of God, even though you worship God, doesn't mean you're not going to encounter the famines of life. You're going to still encounter famine, difficulty, sickness, disease. Worshiping God is not a plan so that you can escape all the difficulties. It never has been, never will be. All right. He finds himself in the middle of a famine. All right. And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. Stop right there. Now, again, the narrative doesn't give us judgment. It just gives us details. It's simply describing what happened. So let's go through this. Commandments, we all understand. We all have commandments. Promises, we have the promises of God. What do we sometimes do with God's commandments and promises? We end up being disobedient. All right? We are disobedient. In the middle of that disobedience, God steps in to encourage. He's there. He encourages, and he reminds them, hey, the Canaanites are here, but guess what? I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to give you this land. Abram does what? He worships. He worships God. Amen. And then he is confronted. He is confronted. He encounters. He experiences the trials and difficulties of life. Or you know what? Let's not even call it. We'll call it. I think we should call it the reality of life, but we'll call it the trials of life, the difficulties of life. He encounters a trial. He encounters a difficulty. I like to use it. He encountered the reality of life. Worship is not we don't worship because somehow we're going to escape the difficulties of life. You are a worshiper of God will find themselves right in the middle of the difficulties of life, just like the people who don't worship God. That's where we end up. Now, here's the question. Somehow, the promises of God, the commandments of God, the promises of God, and the encouragement of God how do I want to state this? I want you to really think about this. Let me do this. Let me state it this way. Why do you think the commandments of God, the promises of God, the encouragement of God, and the worship of God, why do you think it wasn't sufficient to keep Abraham where he was? He's confronted with a famine, and it was grievous. It had to be a very severe famine. But remember, he was when he was encouraged, he was told, hey, I'm going to give you this land. Please go back to the text. Please go back to the text. And the Lord appeared unto Abraham and said, thy seed, he says, unto thy seed will I give this land. Hey, your seed's going to get this land. But somehow, in the midst of all of that, and the worship, the encouragement, the promises, the commandments, when he's confronted with the difficulties of life, he takes off towards Egypt. Do you think that was right, or do you think that was wrong? Again, the text does not place judgment upon it. Now, preachers forever have preached this as he committed, basically he's wrong. This is what happens when you don't trust God, you run to Egypt. When you don't trust God, you run to the world. Or was that's the wise thing to do? They're in a place where the famine is grievous, and he's like, we're going down to Egypt. What do you think? What do you think? Let me state it a different way. In your own personal life, how should the commandments and promises and encouragement of God, and the encouragement that comes from his word, and the worship of God, how should that impact you when you're confronted with the trials and difficulties of life? Do you think that the commandments of God, the promises of God, the encouragement of God, and the worship of God, do you think it had sufficient impact on Abram's decision? I know sometimes I say Abraham, he's still Abram here. Abram's decision to say, we've got to go to Egypt. Do you think it had a sufficient impact, or he was just like, I'm going to Egypt? We have no, obviously, discussion here that God told him to go that way, that God directed him. He's already told him, this is the land I'm going to give your seed. And Abraham's like, well, I've got to leave this land right now because it's a famine. Now, you could say that in Abram's thought is, hey, you're going to give this to my seed? Okay, great. That's future. In the meantime, we're going to starve to death because the famine is grievous. So was it right or wrong? Now, we could debate this all day, but the reason I'm asking you to really think about it is this impacts a lot of sermons. You listen to a lot of sermons and people will just jump up on this and go, Abraham was wrong. And this is a picture of when we are confronted with trials, not running to Egypt, not running to the world, because Egypt is a picture of the world. Well, if you're going to say Egypt is a picture of the world, was Egypt a picture of the world at the time of Abraham? Egypt kind of becomes a picture of the world after the Exodus, right? And then Israel constantly wanting to return back to Egypt. Do you think that's in mind here? Or it's just giving us the details of what he did? Was he right or was he wrong? But I think it is a powerful point. We have the commandments of God. We have the promises of God. We have the encouragement of God's word. We have the worship of God that we are to engage in. We are to be worshipers of God. But what does all of that do for us when all of a sudden everything falls apart in the world around us? All of a sudden we're hit with a grievous famine. What should it do? What should be our response? Now, we know he goes down to Egypt. So here we go. So he's confronted with the reality of a famine, or the reality of life, and it was grievous. And look at verse 11. And it came to pass when he came near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai, his wife, Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Now stop right here. Now we have the deceit. Now this is the hard part about reading Old Testament narratives. It really is. Because how do we judge this? What Abraham's about to do, this deceit, is it wrong? And if we do, what are we judging it on the basis of? Right? We know we're told not to lie later on, but up to this point, is there any commandment against deceit and lying? Now, I think we're going to see that this situation doesn't work out so well, but let's go through this. So let's just work through this, all right? I know we're 32 minutes in, but that's okay. We have the commandments. We have the promises. We have the disobedience. We have the encouragement. We have the worship. We have the trial and difficulty. And now, let's not call it the deceit. Let's call it the decision. Right? In fact, let's do this. Let's call it the decisions. That's even better. We'll call it the decisions. And guess what we'll do? We will include, this is what we'll do. We will include the decision to go to Egypt and the decision to have Sarai lie. He makes two very important decisions. The first decision is we got to leave this land and we got to go to Egypt. And the second decision is right before they go into Egypt, right? When he was come near to enter Egypt, right before he gets close to Egypt, he's like, hey, Sarah, hey, look. You're beautiful. You're a fair woman. And guess what? It's going to come to pass that when the Egyptians shall see you, they shall say, this is his wife. They will kill me, but they will save you alive. So I pray thee, say that you are my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. So, we want to be as fair to the text as possible, right? Because this is stuff that's so easy to preach. I mean, you can go all day on preaching some of this stuff, but the goal here is to try to teach you to think about the text in a way that doesn't lead you to making some of the mistakes preachers make. Because sometimes we're so focused on wanting a sermon that we don't actually focus on the text. Because sometimes the delivery of the sermon is more important than the trustworthiness of the text. We've got to just be honest with what's going on here, right? So let's go through this. Let's think about how we could articulate this, because I think it's very important. We have the commandments. We have the promises. We have the disobedience. We have the encouragement. We have the worship. We have the trial. We have the trial, the difficulties of life, whatever word you want to use there. the reality of life is the way I like to say it, the trials, the realities of life. And then we have the decisions. So we could ask ourselves this: how does the commandments of God, the promises of God, and the encouragement of God, and the worship of God, how do all of those things impact how we deal with, trials and difficulties and the decisions we make? All right? We have these things. We all have these things. We have the commandments of God, the promises of God. We have the encouragement that comes from God's word. We have the worship of God that we are to engage in. When it comes down to the difficulties and trials of life and the decisions do we make, how does all of that come into play? Because it feels like, to me, at least the way the narrative is going, that Abraham is not thinking about the promises of God, the commandments of God. He's not thinking about the worship of God. What he's thinking about is, I've got a famine. Right? And I've got to make a decision, and the decision is to go to Egypt. Oh, wait, I got to make a second decision here. If we go into Egypt, my wife is pretty, they're going to kill me. So, hey, you got to tell them that you're my sister so it'll go well with me. He's not thinking about God's promises. He's not thinking about God's commandments. He's not thinking about God's encouragement. And I think sometimes when we are confronted with the realities and difficulties of life, that we forget all of that church stuff. The church stuff is great in the church service. It's not so great when there's a famine in the land that's grievous. It's not so great when there's a pandemic in the world and we don't like it. It's not so great when everything's going wrong in our family. Then we don't, all of a sudden we don't care about all of that stuff. Is that what we see here? Again, how do you judge what Abraham is doing here? I remember we talked about this. How do we judge many of these Old Testament saints who lived before the law is even given? How do we, you're wrong. Well, based off what? What law are you condemning me by? Now, if God condemns it, then, hey, fine. God can do whatever he wants. But if God doesn't offer a judgment, then what do we do? I think there's a lesson, though. I think the lesson isn't so much about, fleeing into Egypt is a sign of fleeing into the world. I just think that his decisions here seem to not be so much influenced by all of the things that came before it. So he makes the decision. Tells her to lie. All right. And it came to pass that when Abraham was come into Egypt, that the Egyptians behold the woman, that she was very pretty. The princess also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he entreated Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep, oxen, asses, men servants, maid servants, and she asses and camels. Now, please note, he's basically like, hey, I like your sister. And remember, sadly, it's just the reality of the times. The woman was treated, in a sense, like property. Hey, I want her. Look what I got. Okay, I want your sister, and guess what I've got for you? I've got sheep, oxen, asses, men servants, and maid servants, and she asses, and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Now stop right here. All right, so we have the decisions. I think we can see that. The decisions was to go to Egypt, and the decisions was to lie. Next, we'll call this the consequences. And there are consequences from these decisions, right? All right. Consequence, and we could get into that. All of these things happen ultimately because of the decision to go into Egypt. But okay, the consequences ultimately of the decision to make up this lie. What are the consequences? Well, number one, the consequence is that Pharaoh is plagued by God. Pharaoh is plagued by God. Clearly, God is against this action. Clearly, God steps in and like, no, I'm plaguing you, all right? I'm going to send a plague upon you. Verse 18, and Pharaoh called Abraham and said, what is it that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife? Why sayest thou, she is my sister, so I might have taken her to me to wife? Now, therefore, behold, thy wife, take her and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife, and all that he had. All right. what is the consequences? What is the consequences? I'm looking at something here. Okay. What are the consequences of his decision? His consequence is Pharaoh is plagued, number one. Abraham is rebuked, number two. But number three, it seems to me that Abraham comes out with material gain. Is that possible? I'm going to look at something. Look at Genesis chapter 20. Look at Genesis chapter 20, verse 4. Genesis chapter 20, verse 4. No, that's not what I wanted. I was thinking here, hang on. Yeah, let me look up something in a Bible dictionary here. All right? Let me just look up something here. I'm not 100% sure. I don't want to say something unless I'm sure. So just give me a second. If we were all here in person, then we would all be doing this together. Hang on, let me look here. Genesis 12. Yeah, see, okay. I could be wrong. All right. All right. So let's go through this. I'm gonna throw out a possible consequence of this. All right. So stay with me. Here we go. Let's break down Genesis 12. We have the commandments. Then we can all see those. Those are obvious. We have the promises. We have the promises in verse 2, verse 3, and verse 7. You need to know those promises. Write all those promises down. I'm going to call it the disobedience. I don't know how we don't call it disobedience, right? Hey, go, get out, don't take anything, and get away from your kindred, your father's house. Next thing you know, here comes Lot following along with him, right? And Lot, his brother's son, that sounds like a part of his father's house. That sounds like a part of his kindred. Hey, he's bringing them along with him. Next thing you know, we do have this interesting line, and the Canaanite was in the land. And then verse 7, we'll have, so in his disobedience, he's still traveling though. So it's, disobedience, but he's still traveling. That's a good thing. Because even in our disobedience, sometimes there's still, it's still demonstrated that we're trying to do the right thing. But the Lord then appears unto him. I think that's an encouragement. He appears unto him. He tells him, hey, unto this seed, I will give this land. Then we have the worship. Abraham worships. He builds an altar in verse 7. He also builds an altar in verse 8. There we go. We have the worship, all right? Then we have the trial. We have the difficulty. We have the reality of life he is confronted with because a famine hits the land, right? Once he's confronted with this famine, then we have the decisions. He makes two decisions. The first decision, go into Egypt. Second decision is, hey, you're going to have to lie. We're going to have to lie. We're going to have to use some deceit here to keep me alive, all right? So so what is the consequences of their decisions? The consequences of their decisions are, number one, very important. I'm looking at Genesis chapter 14 now, my Bible turned. The consequences are Pharaoh is plagued. Pharaoh is chastised. Pharaoh is punished. Second, Abraham is rebuked. And third, I'm going to say Abraham gets some material gain. Because if you go right into chapter 13, Abraham went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him. And Abraham was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold. He seems to come out of Egypt richer than he went in. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute, why would God do that? Well, this is God keeping his promises that he's going to bless them. He's going to this is mercy. This is grace. God sometimes blesses you even when you have sinned, and that's mercy and that is grace. But there's something I think that comes out of here that we want to consider. They come out of Egypt, it looks like, with material gain. Look at chapter 16. Look at chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian. An Egyptian. Go back to, let's see here. If you go back to Genesis 12, please note when Pharaoh, sees Sarai and he's like, hey, she's pretty. Look what he says. He entreated Abram well, and he had, sheep, oxen. This is Genesis 12:16. Sheep, oxen, asses, men servants, maid servants, and she asses, and camels. Please note, maid servants. Maid servants. Did he give Abram some of these servants and he let him keep that property? And he comes out, and is that where they end up with Hagar? Is that where they ended up with Hagar? Because if it is, then guess what they came out with? They came out with Hagar, which is going to be a source of trouble. So did their journey to Egypt really become a place where they obtain something that's going to create a problem later on? In other words, think of it this way. Is it possible that Abram's his decisions to go to Egypt, his decisions to lie, that all of this entire narrative, that his decisions and the way he responded to the difficulty of a famine ultimately, in the long term, set him up for a major failure and mistake? In other words, the decisions you make today when you are confronted with the realities of life, can they not possibly set you up for spiritual failure, maybe not tomorrow, but 5, 10, 15 years down the road? In other words, you make a decision now based because you're confronted with a situation and you don't take into consideration God's commandments, God's promises. You don't take into consideration your own failure. You don't take into consideration God's encouragement. You don't allow worship to really influence you. Then you're confronted with the reality of life. And then boom, you make two decisions that ultimately put something in your hands, put something a part of your life that will become the very source of trouble later down the road. So let me state it this way. In Genesis 12, I'm going to throw this concept out there, and I think this is a good way of looking at it. I think we're trying to be as fair to the text, and we're not trying to turn the text into an allegory. We're not allegorizing. Is that the right way? We're not using an allegory type approach to the text, because a lot of people do that. They use this kind of allegory idea in their preaching. And what do I mean by that? Well, look, Abraham, he was confronted with a problem. He goes to Egypt. Egypt is a sign of the world. So when you're confronted with problems, don't turn to the world. That sounds so good, but is that really what the text is saying? Here's what I think we can, because I can't say Egypt is a picture of the world in Genesis 12, right? I don't know if I can say that. Here's what I can say. Abraham was given the commandments of God. Abraham was giving promises of God. Abraham disobeyed. Abraham received encouragement because God showed up in a situation where it appeared he may have had concerns and said, hey, I'm going to give your seed this land. That's encouragement, right? Then Abraham worships God, but then he's confronted with a famine, a grievous famine. That's all straight from the text. There's no allegory. There's no twisting the text. And then Abraham makes two important decisions. Let's go to Egypt and let's lie. And then there's consequences. And it appears one of those consequences was that he comes out of Egypt with Hagar. And if that's where he obtained her, well, then guess what? That becomes the source of trouble later on. So let me ask you right now, and I really want you to think about this. I know I keep saying some of this over and over, but that's the point. We work through the text together. That's what being in a Bible Institute is all about, all right? It's not about hearing a sermon. It's about you working through the text, okay? So are you ready? Here we go. I'm going to really drive this point home, okay? Here's what I want you to really think about. How do the commandments of God, the promises of God, your own failure, look, your own failure is one of you can, how can you say this? Your own failure is the best school. Put it this way. Your failure is just as valuable of an instructor as your success and victory. Your failure is a valuable teacher, and we've got to learn from it. So how does the commandments of God, the promises of God, your own failure, your own sin, the encouragement of God that comes from his word, and the worship of God, how does all of that work when you are in your life, when you are confronted with the difficulties and the reality of life? How does all of that come into influence how you deal? When you are confronted with the difficulties of life, do you immediately go back to God's commands, God's promises, your own failure, God's encouragement of his word, and the worship of God? How does that all come into play to impact the decisions you make when you are confronted with the difficulties of life? All right? So I really want you to see that. I really want you to see that, because we have the difficulties of life, we have the decisions, and then we have the consequences. How does all of that impact your decisions? And then I'll ask this question. What decision have you made a year ago, 5 years ago, whatever, that potentially the consequence of that decision created a situation that was going to be detrimental to your spiritual victory in the future? That's very important. Like when they got a handmaid, they didn't probably think anything about having a handmaid when they got the handmaid. But then later on, that handmaid becomes, oh, we have a handmaid. What do you think? What do you think? I'm going to stop right there. You can email me at newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. You really don't have any homework, just for you to think about that and tell me what you think, right? Give me your feedback. Meditate on it. Consider it, right? We'll stop right there. newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. Everyone have a great night. God bless.